Good evening, and welcome to the University of St. Thomas. We are so pleased to see all of you here tonight. I especially want to welcome members of the Germanic American Institute and the German American Chamber of Commerce. Also a warm St. Thomas welcome to Krista Tiefenbacher Hudson, Honorary Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany. Another special guest with us tonight is Timea Takac, who represents the Hungarian Honorary Consulate. On behalf of all of us at the University of St. Thomas, including Provost Richard Plum and his wife Mary Plum, who are with us here tonight, we say welcome. My name is Terry Langen, and I am proud to be the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. The college consists of 23 academic departments in the natural sciences, the social sciences, the fine arts, and the humanities. Of course, the college also includes the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, which is chaired by Dr. Darren Pinto. We are very proud of our strong language programs here at St. Thomas. They're an important piece of the education that we offer our students. While other universities have been backing away from supporting programs in language and culture, we have been adding faculty positions in languages. We now offer instruction in 10 different languages for our students. And of course, one of our stronger language programs is offered in German. Last year, we were fortunate to add to our German faculty Dr. Susanna Wagner. In addition to being excellent in the classroom, Susanna has turned out to be very entrepreneurial. She has already organized a number of outreach programs that bring attention to our German program, including this week's activities and tonight's lecture. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Wagner for her many efforts as I invite her to the microphone.
Thought I was tall, but I guess. What I also didn't know, I think I got a really warm welcome to Minnesota today. When at 6:55 this morning, I tried to step into my first fish house because it was so cold down at the wall. Who went to the wall? Who painted on the wall? Can I see a show of hand? Yeah, excellent. So if you haven't done this, right after this lecture by Professor Hamilton, we will be going down stairs to the wall. We'll smash it in. So maybe if you're really quick afterwards, you can still start. Can we still paint, Heinz? Okay, we can. So if Heinz is quicker than you, he will get the paint out, and maybe you can still put something on the wall, and then we will smash it in. And you are welcome to take this part, or a part of the wall that we will be smashing, home. Maybe the dean would like to have it and display it in the dean's office. Hey, you never know, maybe it gets valuable like the Berlin Wall. Because this event is so popular that one of the attendees here, and I don't know where she is, got told by her advisor from Norway, in Norway, that she should come to this event. Where are you? Oh, okay. So someone in Norway told her she needs to come to tonight's lecture. Isn't that cool? So you're so popular then. Your cousin? Well, we're all cousins. Anyway, I'm really excited about this event. The entire campus weeks are supported by the German embassy in Washington, D.C. Other sponsors are the German program and the German club, and we have also partnered up for a few of the events with the GAI. It probably wouldn't have gone so smoothly if it wasn't for David Steele, who pushed the application through when German almost missed a deadline. But that was fantastic. Thank you, David. Anyway, we had a few events already. We had movie screenings of DEFA-Filme, that's East German. Many of the students had never seen any East German movies. We have a high school to campus program coming up. We have essay contests coming up. We have this lecture and the smashing of the wall coming up. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Andy Staab, who will then introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Andy Staab, and I am a board member of the Germanic American Institute just down the street, Summit Avenue, about 3 miles. I encourage you all to visit, become members. It's pretty cheap. Please do so. I was asked to introduce Dan Hamilton tonight, and I could do the easy route and just sort of read his bio, but that's too easy, and that ain't going to happen. What I'd like to do is dedicate this introduction to the theme of when I knew Dan Hamilton hit the big leagues. That's what my theme is of this introduction. Now, I do encourage you to read his bio. It's pretty impressive. I've known Dan Hamilton for 38 years, and I know what you're thinking. You probably met in preschool, and I thank you for thinking that. But I met him back in 1976 when he was my house counselor at Lagerwaldsee, now known as Waldsee, one of the several language villages of Concordia's language villages. I know we have some CLV people here. Give yourself some shout-outs, CLV people, yes. And we became fast friends then, and I got to work as a counselor with Carl, was his Waldsee name. He became dean of Waldsee, and he hired me for some reason to work as a counselor at Waldsee. And then shortly after that, I became a staff counselor for Carl, and then I became a dean and worked with Dr. Dan Hamilton as a dean, a fellow dean at Waldsee, and it was a wonderful time. I worked for 5 years, and I got the law bug, and I went to law school and became a lawyer, and I sort of lost touch with Waldsee, but not too much. But it was 25 years ago when I knew that was the time when Dan Hamilton made it to the big leagues, because one night, 25 years ago, I was watching ABC News Nightline because that was probably the best source of information about the current event that was burning at the time, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so I was watching, and the theme music came on, da, 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 and Ted Koppel is there, and Ted Koppel says, "Tonight we will be continuing our coverage of the Berlin Wall, and tonight our guest will be former Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Helmut Schmidt." And I'm thinking, how cool is that? Helmut Schmidt, one of my favorite politicians. He was the Bundeskanzler when I was in Hamburg. He was from Hamburg. I lived in Hamburg. We both wore the Elbseglerhut. This is going to be great. I can't wait to hear from Helmut Schmidt. He's going to be talking. We'll be joined with also foreign policy expert from Georgetown University, Dr. Daniel Hamilton. And I went, oh, Carl? He's on Nightline? Now, I could stop right there and say that was when I knew Dan Hamilton made it to the big leagues, but no, it gets better. So Ted Koppel gives a few niceties, and then he throws out this question. He asks our panelists, Helmut Schmidt, Dan Hamilton, about the relevancy of NATO, the military relevancy of NATO now that the Berlin Wall has fallen. Helmut Schmidt gets the first crack. He makes a nice political answer. Dr. Dan Hamilton gives his answer. A little contrary to what Helmut Schmidt had to say. Now, Ted Koppel's a smart, astute journalist, and he catches that, and he says, okay, former Chancellor Schmidt, Dr. Hamilton has made a point that's a little contrary to what you have to say. What is your reply to his response? At this point, if you've seen Nightline, we have the split screen. We've got Helmut Schmidt, we've got Dan Hamilton. And Helmut Schmidt starts this long, babbling diatribe at no direction going all over the map. And I'm looking over at the split screen of Dan Hamilton, and he's giving me that look that only I and others who have worked with him at Waldsee have seen. It's that look of, you may think you know what you're talking about, but I don't think you do. And Koppel, being the astute journalist, catches on to something that Helmut Schmidt is saying during this directionless diatribe. He starts using some of Dan's words and phrases to support his point. Now, Koppel catches that and says, wait a minute. Didn't Dr. Hamilton just say that in his support of his position, and now you're using it to support? I don't understand. So then he gives Schmidt another chance to present his case. But there are the split screens there, and then finally Dan can't take it. After about 30 seconds of babbling, he cuts and says, "That's what I was saying!" And I'm going, "Oh, did he just cut off the chancellor?" Yeah, he did. Excellent. And you could just see the look on Helmut Schmidt's face, like. And we went to commercial break, and if I were a fly on the wall, I would love to have been there during the commercial break to hear whatever discussion that was there. If we had social media, if we had texting back then, I would have been on my phone texting Dr. Dan saying, "You just owned the chancellor. Way to go. That was great." But we didn't have, the only form of social media we had back then was pick up a phone, write a letter, heckle somebody from your second floor dorm window. But really, all I really wanted to do was to say, "Way to go, Dan." When we came back from the commercial break, the rest of the show was a two-way dialogue between Ted Koppel and Dan Hamilton with Helmut Schmidt kind of off to the side. Now, I don't think Helmut Schmidt ever got invited back, but I know who did get invited back to ABC News Nightline, not just to talk about the Berlin Wall, but he also talked about other things like Bosnia and other important topics. Now, before I introduce him, I do want to commend the University of St. Thomas for being open-minded and tolerant by allowing an Ole and a part-time summer employee of Concordia College to come speak here. Your openness and tolerance speak volumes. Congratulations. We know he's hit it big time. He's in the big leagues. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Hamilton.
Thank you so much. There's more to that story, but we'll talk about it later. It's a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate it so much, and I want to thank the College of St. Thomas and Frau Wagner, Professor Wagner, and her colleagues for doing everything here, the dean and everyone. Thank you so much. It's a great honor, and I think it's fun also the way we're trying to do it, to try to make this relevant event that happened some time ago. So thanks again for your service and to education and to promotion of German language here in Minnesota. Let me also thank Andy Staub for taking the initiative to get us all here together as well. As he has said, his name is Gustav, by the way. I've enjoyed a lot of wonder years with Gustav. Very fun and productive, and just a wonderful colleague. And it's immer eine Freude. And I also want to thank Heinz. What was Heinz? Heinz? Da ist er. Dallas Dietz, Heinz, who built the wall early this morning. That's out in the courtyard here. And Holtz Construction Company for being part of, for doing that and building the wall we all hope to knock down tonight. On November 9th, 1989, I found myself on the eastern side of the Berlin Wall, and I was in the apartment of a dissident pastor who I had gotten to know. And his church provided a safe haven for dissidents who at that time were looking to be able to talk in essentially what was much of a police state. And this pastor's name was Rainer Eppelmann. And we were in his apartment, and he motioned me over and pointed out the bugs that are in his apartment from the Stasi, secret police. And he motioned me so we could go into part of his house where he thought no one was listening. It was basically his closet. And we started talking about how thousands of people were coming out in the streets every Monday in East German cities. First go to church service and then come out of church and go out on the streets, basically protesting peacefully about what was happening to their country. And he was telling me the people are afraid. They're very afraid, he said. They were concerned that the East German security forces would start to use force, and that the 300,000 Soviet troops stationed in East Germany might also do the same. There was no certainty about when they went out in the streets those nights what would happen to them. But they were heartened in those days by what was happening in Poland. Just not too far away, the Solidarity trade union, Solidarność, which had been banned, Poland had been under martial law for much of the 1980s, had come back, and they had just had free elections in Poland that essentially elected Solidarity as the new government. And these people in East Germany were heartened by the tones they were now hearing from Moscow, from Mikhail Gorbachev, who basically was not giving any indication that he minded that these things were now happening in the Soviet bloc. And Eppelmann was a very interesting figure because he was the pastor of the Samariterkirche, so the Good Samaritan Church in East Berlin. And some years earlier, he came up with the idea of how do you attract young people to church in a communist state where basically you are discriminated against if you're affiliated with a church. And how do you get people to talk in a state in which everyone's scared? So he came upon the idea to feature what he would call bluesmessen. So church services featuring American blues music, very subversive force, always in history. But he really, had musicians come, they would play the music, and on the margins people would then talk about what was going on. And the church was this little safe haven for him to do that. Pretty soon rock musicians started showing up. It became really quite a thing. And this was sort of it wasn't secret, but it was sort of the cult thing for young people to do in East Germany, is go to church because that's where you could get the rock music and you could actually talk. But as soon as you left the church, then it was hard. So Eppelmann was really playing a big role in East Germany. And as Andy said, I didn't know he was going to tell that story. At the time I was working with Nightline, they had hired me to be a consultant for them, given everything that was going on, to help them film all the dramatic changes going on in Germany and Poland and so on. So because they were going to produce a series of documentaries, specials, on what was going on in Eastern Germany. So I was taking their producer to the Bluesmessen, and we would sit there and listen to the people express their angst, their fears and all their concerns. So I saw Eppelmann that day, November 9th, 1989, and then I had to get home in West Berlin, so I crossed back over the wall through Checkpoint Charlie, as I did quite a bit in those days, maybe every couple of weeks. My job at the time was with the Aspen Institute, which is it's based in Colorado, but it's a nonprofit group that does conferences and things. And we had a little branch in West Berlin with the idea that East and West could maybe talk to each other across that wall. And so that meant I had to go over to the East quite a bit, and that's what I did. And that's how I got to know some of these people. So I went back over because I had to get to a reception. My institute, we were going to have a reception that night for a new colleague. And it showed, really, the fact we're having this reception, and actually who came, that no one was expecting that later that evening the Berlin Wall would come down. We had the mayor of West Berlin at this reception. We had West Berlin politicians all over. We had U.S., Soviet, and East German political figures all together in this little institute in western part of Berlin because we were having a cocktail reception for somebody. And so you kind of always think when these dramatic moments happen, where were you, right, when something happened? So at 7 p.m. that night, I have to recollect that, I was talking at this reception to a fellow named Wolfgang Fogel. Wolfgang Fogel was somewhat notorious at the time because he was the guy that used to get out and trade the spies. He would be paid, and the regime in East Germany for buying people out, basically, from the East. And that was his job, was to negotiate that. And also just normal people who were trying to leave, and they would pay huge sums, and they would buy him out. So he was at this reception. And I remember, it was such dramatic times, I'd just seen Eppelmann, I said to him, what do you think's going to happen here? And he said, you know, the Communist Party is not going to be able to withstand this pressure, and something pretty dramatic is going to happen sometime soon. It was just at that moment, when those words left his lips, he didn't know that. On the other part of town, back in the east, the communist leadership was meeting, and they had just decided that East Germans could actually travel if they had a passport, which almost none of them did. And so they'd have to go get passports, and you know, but they could start to travel. But their spokesman mangled the announcement. He blew it in front of the world press, and the run on the wall began. Because individuals took things into their own hands. And as the throngs of people then went to the wall, the individual border guards who were faced with all of this had to take things into their own hands. They had a simple choice. Do you shoot or do you open the gate? And it was those individual border guards without instructions, because they hadn't gotten any yet, that finally, with sort of a shrug, they lifted the barrier, and about 60 people went across the Chausseestrasse in Berlin before they had gotten the phone call about what to do. So neither Wolfgang Fogel nor any of our guests at the same time knew what was happening. And in fact, the number 2 U.S. diplomat based in East Berlin was at our reception. And he knew Fogel, and he said, "You want to ride back to the east?" So Fogel gets in his car, and the two of them are driving back to the east, and they hear that the wall has come down on the car radio together. And that was the moment the Cold War really started to crack. That's when the German people started to come together, and the world started to change. And that night, I can tell you, Berlin was simply the world's biggest fest party. The city that had become the symbol of Europe's divisions suddenly became the symbol of how Europe was going to come together again. And it came together, and that wall came down because individuals on that night made a real difference. But if you look a lot at German history, you look at what happened in those days, you will realize that the Berlin Wall actually did not fall on November 9th, and it didn't fall in Berlin. It was actually on October 9th, and it was in Leipzig. So some weeks before, I talked about these people going out in the streets, and that's what was happening. All the streets in all the big cities, but particularly in Leipzig, another big German city. And again, where individuals can make a difference. So Valentina Kosch, she decided that Monday, October 9th, to go to the peace service because she just had it. She thought she was going to be shot by the East German guards that night. She even told her 6-year-old and her 3-year-old daughters that she was going to take a walk with her friends, and she was going to talk to her friends so that the teachers in their school would be nicer to their pupils, which was actually something that she probably needed to do. And then she told her husband that if she didn't get home by 10 o'clock p.m., that he should take the 2 girls and move to Dresden, to another town, leave Leipzig, be gone, and start a new life, because she didn't want those 2 girls to be branded as children of an enemy of the state. And she thought she wasn't coming home. Now, like most East Germans at that time, Valentina Kosch was not political. She wasn't trying to make any big political statement. But she had been a teacher, and she decided she would introduce, a couple years earlier, Montessori methods in her school. She thought that was the right thing to do. It was kind of fun. It was a good way to learn. And because of this breach of the rules, she was demoted, and she was put in a classroom with special needs kids, even though she had no training or background to take care of their needs. So she felt hopeless, she felt trapped, and she was fed up. And she gathered her courage, and she went out to the Monday service. And that weekend before, in October, the security forces had rounded up several thousand demonstrators. And in Leipzig, the watchdogs there, the security forces, even, if you can even believe this, tone deaf to German history, had even started to rehearse plans to inter thousands of dissidents in new types of camps. And the hospitals had been stocked with extra blood plasma because they thought this was going to be a serious clash that night. And all the Leipzigers knew it, of course. And so the city security forces were beefed up to about 8,000, and the demonstrators were probably going to be about 10,000. So this was serious. This was going to be a serious confrontation. They'd been issued live ammunition. They were told to use whatever means necessary to suppress what was called the counter-revolution, which is the worst thing you can be accused of in the communist law books. But when Valentina Koch went out that night after the church service, and she and thousands of other individuals braved and gathered their courage, the Soviet troops stayed in their barracks. And at the last minute, a call came to tell the East German security forces not to fire. And that was Germany's first successful, peaceful revolution ever. And looking back, some of the people from the regime, started to explain what happened. And one of them, his name was Horst Sindermann, who was the head of their parliament. He said, "We were ready for everything that night, everything, except candles and prayers." And a month later, the wall came down in Berlin, but the government hadn't really changed. And so as these Monday demonstrations continued, even after the Berlin Wall came down, you could see that individuals were taking things into their own hands. The East German flag started to disappear. And in its place, interestingly, was not a different German flag or national German, West German flag. It was the old flags of the German Länder, of Sachsen and Thüringen, Brandenburg, historic, regional identities of the Germans that had actually been verboten by the communist regime, which had created administrative districts. And that was the identity of the East Germans. It wasn't some nationalist fervor, it was back to their roots, which were local. And so you saw suddenly these old flags that they hadn't seen for decades suddenly reappear. And then, after a few of these weeks, you did see a new flag appear, the West German flag. But for most of the people on the streets in the East, that flag was not the symbol of what they were about. They wanted a different symbol of the West. It wasn't the West German flag, it was the Deutschmark, which you could argue for 40 years was really the symbol of West Germany. And they started, the banners you started to see on the streets was, if the Deutschmark doesn't come to us, we're going to go to it. The walls are down, it's one way or the other. And that force from the streets started to really get way ahead of politics. So only a few months later, the East Germans already voted for their first and only democratic government. Wolfgang Fogel, the spy traitor, and the regime were swept away. And Pastor Eppelmann, Rainer Eppelmann, was made Minister of Defense. His main job was to put himself out of business as fast as he possibly could by uniting with the West. And by July, both German lands had the Deutschmark. And by October, Germany was again one country. Now, Andy mentioned this, again, we didn't talk about it, but 2 months after the wall opened, I went back to ABC and Ted Koppel, and I said, whatever happened to the documentaries? Because, we had worked a lot on this. And they looked at me and they said, you know what? It's all on hold because the ratings in America for that series that had been doing. Helmut Schmidt and everybody else had just plummeted. The Cold War was ending and America had tuned out. No one was watching. And that show was never shown. And the focus group interviews the ABC executives later had, they found out that people just had a hard time understanding, what these changes meant. They were distant events in faraway places caused by people about whom they knew very little. And so 25 years later now, of course, our world has moved on pretty far from the days of the Berlin Wall. And a generation has come of age knowing nothing of its existence. And I see students here, seniors graduating this year from St. Thomas, right? If you do the math, were born after the wall collapsed. It all seems like ancient history. And if it didn't seem to make a difference to people who were living through it then, we can understand, it's understandable that people today might ask, what difference does it make now? So what difference does it make? What difference did it make? Well, I think one lesson the wall should teach us is to be prepared for change, because so many people found it so hard to understand when the fall of the wall meant, because so many had grown to live with it and grow accustomed to it. It became a natural part of the Cold War's life. We said we wanted the wall to go away, but 2 generations, if we're honest, built their lives and their careers on the assumption it would never go away. If we're honest, the people at the time thought about the Cold War the same way one of our greatest philosophers in the United States, Dan Quisenberry, he was a relief ace for the Kansas City Royals, thought about the future. He said, "I've seen the future, and it's much like the present, only longer." That was the Cold War view of history and of life. It would just go on like that. The idea that suddenly, peacefully, this wall would come down and the black and white lines would turn into the abstract colors of a Jackson Pollock painting was just beyond imagination. And so a whole lot of people found themselves on both sides of that wall really well trained to deal with a world that no longer existed. The world had changed, and it's best summed up by an even greater philosopher than Dan Quisenberry, and that, of course, is Yogi Berra, who said, "The future ain't what it used to be." And I think that's what has governed us since then. So in our rush to move beyond and leave that wall and its world behind, it's worth maybe reflecting a bit on its meaning for the world ahead. Because that wall didn't just separate the world of our consciousness, of our understanding, from a world we didn't comprehend, but it's very cold and concrete barbed wire made very tangible, all too tangible. The many intangible walls that still divide us today, particularly the walls between those who want to open up societies and those who want to shut them down. In Berlin, the wall of concrete came down, but for most of the past 25 years, the Germans have been coping with a different type of wall they call die Mauer im Kopf, the wall in their heads, because it's hard to get your mind around the fact that this country simply came together with very different perspectives and traditions. These kinds of walls, the intangible walls, they're not ancient history. They're what's with us right now, today, in Europe, in the world, in our daily lives. And so on an anniversary like this, I suggest they compel us to reconsider the earthquake that brought down those walls a quarter of a century ago, and whether what we do or don't do as individuals and what we do or don't do as a country make a difference. So let me give you an example of how, from other milestones this year, we can start to maybe answer that question. Because this year is also the 70th anniversary of the end of the closing days of World War II. In November 1944, Allied forces were closing in on Germany. We had landed in Normandy and were moving from the west, and the Soviets were coming from the east to liberate Germany from the Nazis. In the west, we were about to face really stiff resistance, the last response from the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge, which was in December, which was a battle that finally broke the resistance, and it led to the end of the war. But in most of Central Europe, over these next coming months, 70 years ago, the liberation from the grip of the Third Reich did not lead to freedom, as it did in Western Europe and in much of Germany itself. By the end of May 1945, General Patton's armies, which had gone way into Bohemia, withdrew. They left the Red Army in control, not only in Czech and Slovak lands, but throughout the region, because that was our arrangement. And the hope of liberation gave way to a very sober reality of foreign rule and what was to become the Cold War. And America's withdrawal from that region was part of a general retrenchment of the United States from global commitments and responsibilities in these initial post-war years. Understandable. American society and the soldiers they had deployed so far from American shores simply ached to have them come home, to gain the peace dividend that we had achieved and to build a better future at home. Europe was finally fixed, we thought. Peace is achieved, we had made a difference, and now it's time for the troops to come home. Meanwhile, Europe was a mess. It was devastated, it was unable to get back in business. And so the United States, instead of sending people, we sent money, because the United States economy was the only one that hadn't been devastated by the war. So between 1945 and 1948, we provided $15 billion to Europe to get it, to turn it back on in those dollars. Heck of a lot of money at the time. And by 1948, however, we realized it had done almost nothing. Europe was still flat on its back, and it was just traumatized by the effects of 2 world wars and everything that happened in between. It was only then that American leaders, when we thought about it, understood that we couldn't retrench, we couldn't abstain, and that checkbook diplomacy alone was not enough, and that we had to do something different. We had to engage on the European continent again, and we had to contribute to Europe's future. But this time we said to the Europeans, you have to lead the way. We will provide you funds. You tell us how to use it. And do it together, which was a revolution for the Europeans who had just been killing themselves for 70 years. And that was the Marshall Plan. Now, everyone remembers the Marshall Plan because it was such a success. But I think people think about the Marshall Plan only as money, and I think the real story of the Marshall Plan was the plan and not the money. Because we said, you won't get the money unless you, together, overcome all the trauma, and you tell us what will happen with it. And they did. And in the end, Europe turned back on. It was a huge change. And in the end, the Marshall Plan was $13 billion. Still a heck of a lot of money. It wasn't as much money as we had just spent the 3 years before. And nobody remembers those $15 billion. Everybody remembers the Marshall Plan. So it wasn't about money, it's about the message behind the plan, the message behind the money, that we were engaged as a European power. American troops returned to Europe, we stayed our course and we stayed our ground, and we stayed by policies that seemed very odd at the time. We committed to ending the division of Germany when 300,000 Soviet troops were in part of it. we committed to protecting the isolated, walled-in city of West Berlin when it was surrounded by those troops. We refused to recognize the Soviet incorporation of the Baltic states, even though they were actually part of the USSR. Most people thought this was very odd. And there are, of course, limits to this, because uprisings in East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland were all crushed, and we did nothing about that. And the wall, of course, was built anyway. But the Atlantic Alliance provided an umbrella under which European unity could develop, in which the open societies of Europe could overcome and reconcile their history and produce unparalleled peace and prosperity for half a century, even if only for half a continent. But because of that, in the East, the pressures started to build again until the message that had expressed by very lonely souls for some decades started to grow to that year 1989 until it became really a crescendo. And if you had to take all the banners and all the messages of all the people on the streets of Gdansk and Leipzig and Budapest and you name it, it was really one message. We want to return to Europe. We want to be part of the Europe we had always been part of, except of where the Red Army happened to be in the summer of 1945. And it was that message, the message of Rainer Eppelmann, and the message of Valentina Koch, and thousands of individuals like them, the demand to open their societies, the simple demand for a better life, that was the earthquake that caused those walls to go down. Margaret Mead is a famous anthropologist, and she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." And so those individuals, each of them on their own, but together, finally made a difference. But they made a difference because we made a difference as countries. They summoned their courage because they could imagine an alternative. But if you look in those days of the end of the Cold War, it was unclear, again, another peace dividend, whether Americans would stay the course or, again, time to come home. In Germany and in Central Europe, we acted. American support for the unification of Germany was unbelievable and is really what made it happen. We also took in Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and other countries later. The Baltic states, independent, now part of the West, free, prosperous, secure. But at that same time, in southeastern Europe, we didn't act, we abstained. Violence started to engulf the Balkans, and we stepped back and stopped short. The famous quote was Secretary Baker at the time, James Baker, who said, we have no dog in that fight. And the Europeans, fresh from unification, said, "You're right, we'll take care of it." And the result was that more Europeans died in the 10 years following the Berlin Wall's collapse than in the 28 years it was up in this part of Europe. And so our failure to resist this temptation to step back, and our joint failure to understand that America's role as a European power, not just a power in Europe, was really the greatest failure of the West since the end of World War II. It was unbelievable tragedy. And again, maybe many people here, are still too young to even know. But this year we marked the 19th anniversary of really ghastly genocidal acts at Srebrenica and other parts of the Balkans. And we understood only then, too late, that there was no really an alternative except to act. So we applied the same lessons we had learned earlier. Once again, we worked to bring the Balkans into Europe. And our message was the same. They could become part of the mainstream. They could create a better life for themselves. We would stand with them, but they had to lead the way. They had to get over some of the historical traumas that they inflicted on each other, and only if they're prepared to do that could they do this. But we would be there. That was the point that made the difference. They're only going to summon the courage to make those tough choices for change if they know we stand with them. And today there's still really big problems in the Balkans. But the people of that region, at least, have a real chance of joining the Europe of open societies. And again, American engagement has made the difference. We should be proud of this, but we can't afford to be complacent. And we have to tune in, because there's still many more walls to fall. Now, after September 11th, 2001, many pointed to different kinds of walls. They pointed to a clash of civilizations. I suggest we're not engaged in a clash of civilizations. We're engaged in the same clash that I've been describing between prejudice and respect, between those who would open societies and those who would close them. And in this case, who would use religion to build and those who would use religion to destroy. The fault lines of the world we live in today, they don't run between civilizations. They run through them. In this case, between those who are trying to hijack great religions and those seeking to live by their teachings. Between those who are trying to suppress freedom and those who seek to extend it. And nowhere is this evident today as in the Middle East. But these walls are with us in many parts of the world. And today in Europe, the epicenter of the earthquake is in Ukraine. Just read the headlines again today, what's happening there. And once again, we face a choice, whether to act and engage or whether to abstain. There's great temptation to see Ukraine as an episode. Let's just get this over with and get back to business. They don't seem to know, how to take care of themselves anyway, right? I would argue we were fooling ourselves if we think it's an episode. It is a symptom that the walls in our heads persist. And if you know something about this part of Europe, you know that those divisions have always left an indelible mark on this neighborhood. Because for generations, Ukraine and its neighbors have been what the Germans used to call Zwischeneuropa, the in-between lands that were always the cockpits of violence and confrontation. If you think about history in this world, a 96-year-old person from Galicia, which is part of present-day Ukraine, she was born in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. She came of age in the Polish Republic. She survived World War II as a Soviet citizen under German occupation. She was reintegrated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. And for the past 2 decades, she's lived as a citizen of Ukraine, and she hasn't left her house. She's seen the 2 worst wars in history and the Cold War begin in her neighborhood. She's lived through colored revolutions, you name them. Red, black, red, white, orange, and blue. And if you walk down the streets of her hometown of Lviv or Lvov or Lemberg, you can see the past everywhere. You see those divisions everywhere. In the marble steps of the Habsburgs, and the German names engraved on public fixtures, in the Baroque church of the old Polish Commonwealth, in the cracked windows of the synagogue or on the courtyard of the Armenian church, and in buildings dedicated to Hungarian merchants or adorned with Yiddish or Cyrillic inscriptions. Divisions are everywhere, and they're rooted deeply in the past. But I think the question that should preoccupy us today is whether she and her children and grandchildren, I guess great-grandchildren, believe their future is much like the present, only longer, or whether she and others like her are determined that the future can no longer be what it used to be. Much of it depends on them. They have to lead the way. But they're more likely to muster the courage to make those tough choices for a new and open society if they know we will be there with them. That is the lesson of history in Europe. In Asia, the walls are still there as well. We see it tangibly in the Koreas, who were separated by minefields of separating humanity. It's evident in Pakistan, where a 17-year-old girl, Malala Yousafzai, was shot 3 times in the face because she said girls should have better education. One child, one teacher, one pen, one book, she said, can change the world. And she won the Nobel Prize. In Africa, the walls are evident in the faces of millions of people still without access to simple forms of electricity or energy, who haven't joined the continent's new promise. In South Africa, it's evident in the favelas and in the shanty towns of the continent's great cities. And the walls are here with us at home. In our paralyzed politics, in the everyday struggle of Americans, millions of them, to simply get by. We're not going to make a difference abroad if we can't make a difference for individuals right here at home. Because the relevance of open society for others is related to the belief that they work for their own people. And we are struggling. So if we can't get our acts together at home, we're not going to act together very well abroad. And we can't afford to tune out. There is a strong temptation, I know, to focus on problems at home, to take care of our own. But how do you take care of your own today in a world in which diseases that were once thought to be distant scourges can become local dangers? How do we get on with our lives in a world where it takes hours to cross the ocean, or minutes to flash news, or seconds to transfer money? How do we get on with our lives when violence in Gaza can generate street riots in Paris? When U.S. or European residents leave cities like Minneapolis and Frankfurt for jihadi training camps in Somalia and Syria or the Hindu Kush, or when al-Qaeda-inspired copycat terrorists plan to blow up installations in Dallas or Madrid. France's former foreign minister, Bernard Kouchner, has been the most direct. He says to people, do you want peace, or do you want to be left in peace? Because if you only want the latter, we'll never get the former. So how do we start? Well, I think for starters, as I said, you can't tune out. Thinking that we don't have to care about distant events in faraway places caused by people about whom we know little. That's what the British said about the Balkans 100 years ago, another anniversary we're commemorating. And the war that was sparked in that year engulfed Britain, engulfed Europe, and engulfed the world. So as individuals, knocking down the walls mean having eyes that are open and minds that are open to other perspectives. And for that, here's my ad for Susanne Wagner. Knowing another language might help you open those perspectives. So, there's a famous musician named Isaac Stern. He was asked one time, why do professional musicians always seem to be able to play the same notes in the same order, but some sound really wonderful, some sound pretty awful? And he scratched his head and he said, it's not the notes that are important, it's the space between the notes. And I think that's a pretty wise comment. It's not only about music, but it's about our ability to dress these walls that are still to fall. Because the space between the notes is the difference between information and judgment, between facts and insight. And that's what another perspective, another language, knowing something about others can give you. It can be a compass in a sea world of constant change. And of course, my little ad here, because as people know, we're all here, particularly from the German clan, as to that, if you have to choose a language, you might think you might try a little German, because it can help you with your English. German or English are both Germanic languages, right? In fact, I know my French friends will love this. English is really just a German language, except it's a German language that's simply eaten too many French dishes for its own good. So German is really good for every English-speaking Mensch. Whether you're a Kindergartner, right, a Student, or you're just one of the Familie. So whether it's German, whether it's another language, pick one. Find out about the other. You can't find out about the other unless you know, can speak to them. This summer, at the language villages, our quote was from Nelson Mandela, who said, you know, you really can't understand somebody until you speak to their heart. And that you have to do in their own language. So Germans have a lot of handy words. One is called Hammer. And I think tonight what we want to do is take a hammer and go knock down some walls that are to fall. We should be thankful we don't know the Iron Curtain. We don't know that we have a world without the Berlin Wall. But we should be realistic that there are many more walls to fall. And they can be found everywhere in this world, including right here at home. George Bernard Shaw said, freedom means responsibility. That's why so many people fear it. It inspires and imposes obligations. It imposes obligations on the free to advance freedom for those who are not free. And that's the obligation and the challenge that the walls still to fall impose on us. If you go back to Berlin these days, part of the wall is still there. And they invited artists from all over the world to come and paint a big, long section of it in eastern Berlin. This remarkable stretch of the wall now is called the East Side Gallery. And I recommend you go see it. And on one of the segments of the wall, an artist has done his artwork, and he painted the following. Viele kleine Leute, die in vielen kleinen Orten viele kleine Dinge tun, können das Gesicht der Welt verändern. Many little people who in many little places do many little things can change the face of the world. If we tune out, if we abstain, we often end up paying a much higher price later. If we act, and particularly if we act together, we have it within us to do remarkable things. That's history's lesson. That's the lesson of the Berlin Wall, and that is the challenge to us of the walls that are still to fall. So thank you for joining me, and I think we will be going to the wall to knock some down in a bit, and I'm wondering whether Susanna wants me to open this up? Yeah? Okay. Good. Okay. So I think whoever would like to question or comment? Yeah. Great.
Yes. I recognize your remarks are not economically focused, but I'm interested in your comments. The former East Germany was so-called my witness numbers significantly higher on the rate, nearly 10% versus 6% in the West. A lot less industry. Actually, this was maybe one of the first examples of the effect that the East Germany has made a tremendous comeback in cities like Potsdam, Vienna, Dresden, have made some progress. Just curious, in your mind, how much of that lack of progress in the rest of East Germany do you allow them to cup, or are there other measures that could help bring forward?
Yeah, so the question is, Germany is unified, but Eastern Germany hasn't done as well in many parts of it, and how do we think about that? I criticized my West German colleagues because what they did was do what we did between 1945 and 1948, is they threw Deutschmarks at the problem without having much of a plan. The plan was they want to come to us, so they want to be just like us. And so we'll build everything that we built in West Germany, except we'll do it now over here, to the same standards and everything. And that was very expensive. In fact, the greatest peacetime transfer of wealth in human history between West and East Germany. Unbelievable. The best Autobahns in the world are in Eastern Germany today because they're brand new and shiny. They do really cool things. You want to go 300 kilometers an hour, you know, you're really good. But that wasn't attuned to what the people needed, which is basic fixtures, basic things to make life work again. And so I think a lot of it, you know, was wasted. A lot of it fell on ground that didn't turn the economy around. So a lot of East Germans did what they said. If the Deutschmark doesn't come to us, we'll go to it. And you'll see many pockets of Eastern Germany now pretty depopulated. But I think that's changing. And I think that was the story of 20 years. But I think in the last number of years, you're seeing some changes. If you go to Dresden today, it's an unbelievably beautiful city. And the commitment those people have had to restore it is quite something. Leipzig does have industry again, and you know, American companies, in fact, Opel, American company GM, and ADM and some others have invested really a lot now in Eastern Germany. And what happened with when the EU enlarged, the European Union, to take in Poland and the Czech Republic, is what happened is companies extended all of their networks across the whole single market now, feeding back into the German economy. So all to the east, that's why Poland in part has done so well, actually, is because German industry and American industry actually have settled there and tied into the big single market, 500 million people, the biggest actual, you know, really the market in the world, bigger than the United States. So it's turning around, and it's doing better. And of course, they've gone through an awful recession, as we did, and it's lingered. But if you compare that in Eastern Germany to what's going on in Greece or in other parts of Europe, they're doing much better.
As a follow-on to that, you said Angela Merkel has received some significant criticism from her, especially Mediterranean-based neighbors, who really need to deflate their currencies and not have the German model of austerity, which has worked without any doubt in the EU for Germany, but has not necessarily served those other nations well. What do you see for the future of the EU, and how can Germany let down that wall that protects them now?
Right, so I said greatest peacetime transfer of wealth in human history. So the Germans for 20 years were pretty preoccupied with themselves. And that hurt their growth. They didn't really invest again. They were throwing money at the unification issue and, you know, have turned around a lot. But that was 20 years of inward focus. And it's easy to forget that 10 years ago, we were talking about Germany as the sick man of Europe, because they hadn't invested in the reforms. They've been throwing money at other things, but hadn't done some serious structural reforms. But they did that in the intervening years. They were just ready to have turned it all around. In fact, they had 2008. Germany was back, and bam, the recession hit. And so the Germans, who are sensitive to these kinds of swings in economic fortune, if you think about the 20th century, they get a little nervous when you talk about debt and about priming the pump again. They just went through it as it. Greatest peacetime transfer of wealth in human history, and now everybody wants us to do something like that again now for Europe, when we were the sick man of Europe. So it's a hard argument to make to a German audience, especially when they look at their demographics, because Germany is getting older and shrinking. And it's still not come to terms with whether it's an immigrant society or not, even though it is. And unless they take in more people, the United Kingdom will be bigger than Germany in 2 decades. Turkey is now bigger than Germany. So if you think about old age and a young population that's got to support that, it's getting to be a serious crunch the Germans are going to go through, and they know that. So it's not that they're being, miserly. They're looking at some trends ahead that are not all in the best. And then when you come to the EU, they were the first ones to break the rules on the euro. We said you can't have these budget limits, and then they blew it apart. The Germans did, and they know that. And so their argument is, you know, if we do it again, that'll just let everybody else do it too. So the chancellor is really pushing very hard and got the screws to everyone, because it's not about not giving them money, it's about using austerity to force change, in structural change, what the Germans say they had to do anyway. Why doesn't anybody else do it? And I think so. That's the debate. I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just saying that is sort of the logic of how they discuss it, which means they want to see where are these countries that want more support and growth are changing their economies, not just looking to prime the pump and putting in more debt again. And that's sort of the argument. And I think the second argument, which I think isn't getting as much attention here, about the energy revolution in Germany, which is being undercut a little bit by our own at the moment, but you know, it's not about a knee-jerk reaction the Germans have to Fukushima and being ideological. They're really trying to break through to a new industrial model. That's why German business actually still is kind of bought into this idea of super energy efficiency. Because if you can get to the point where you can break the link, the historic link, between the production of wealth and the consumption of resources, you're in a new world. And if Germany can do it first, they've positioned the German economy for something completely unbelievable. That's their gamble. So part of it is not, you know, again, is being really tough on the structural stuff, because they're trying to restructure their own economy in this very different way. So there's a lot that goes into that. It's not just a growth or no growth argument, but you know, the jury is out of whether it's really having effect. Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. This was fantastic. And you know what? For the first time in over 10 years, about 17 lucky UST students are going to go to Berlin in January for the first time. And we're going to see the wall or what's staying is still there. And Professor Piankowski and I will show you around. Many of them are actually here tonight, so this is very good. So you're now ready to bundle up and go outside and get some aggression out. Thank you so much for coming.